Welcome to the deep dive. In today's world, it really can feel like we're just drowning in information sometimes. Every headline, every social media feed, every chat, it seems like there's a new story, a new angle on reality. And some of these narratives, well, they seem to spread incredibly fast, don't they? Weaving these complex webs. Sometimes they're really hard to untangle. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into something that's, well, it's been around for centuries, but it feels more prominent now, more impactful than ever: conspiracy theories. Our mission here in this deep dive is really to pull out the most important bits of knowledge, the key insights from a whole range of sources you've shared with us. We want to move beyond just, dismissing these things out of hand. We really want to try and understand them from lots of different angles. It's about grasping why they pop up, how they get traction, and, what effect they actually have on society. Think of it as a shortcut, maybe, to being genuinely well-informed on a topic that touches, well, so many parts of modern life.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating when you look at the sources is just how many different fields are trying to grapple with this, often from completely different starting points, asking different questions. We've got historical analyses, looking at where this kind of thinking comes from, how it's changed over time. Then there's psychological studies, digging into the individual mind, the cognitive biases involved. Plus, there's really cutting-edge stuff on computational detection, how AI is learning to spot these patterns, and also sociocultural studies, looking at how these theories actually spread through communities, through society. So altogether, these give us a pretty broad lens, right? Historical, psychological, technological, sociological, helps us try and get a handle on this really complex, always shifting landscape.
It is incredibly intricate, and it makes you ask right away, doesn't it? A key question for you, our listener. What do we actually mean when we say conspiracy theory? And are they all the same, or has our understanding maybe changed over time? Let's start there. Let's look at how the very concept of conspiracy theories has evolved, especially in academic thinking. Now, when most people hear conspiracy theory, they probably think of Richard Hofstadter, right? His big idea, the paranoid style, from back in the mid-20th century.
Oh, absolutely. That was hugely influential, came out in the 1960s.
And the idea was basically that these theories were sort of fringe things, irrational deviations from how most people think.
Exactly. He often painted it that way.
Right.
Characterizing believers as being driven by paranoia, this kind of almost pathological distrust of authority. It really framed these beliefs as being outside normal, rational conversation.
But that's where things have shifted a bit in academia, hasn't it?
Yeah, significantly since Hofstadter. I mean, his work was foundational, no doubt, really shaped how people saw it. But lots of scholars now challenge that, or at least add a lot more nuance. They're showing the history of this kind of thinking is way more complicated than just a paranoid fringe. Take Michael Fowle, for example. He looked at antebellum America, the period before the Civil War, and he tried to make a distinction between a paranoid style of the fringe, like Hofstadter talked about, and what Fowle called a political style of the center. He argued that some theories back then, especially ones that were part of mainstream political talk, didn't really fit Hofstadter's mold. It suggests maybe suspicion of conspiracy wasn't always seen as irrational in politics.
Okay, so maybe it wasn't always fringe.
Well, it gets even stronger if you go further back to 18th century America. That's what historian Gordon Wood argued. Wood made this really compelling case that back then conspiracy theorizing wasn't fringe at all. It was seen as a rational activity. Yeah, deeply embedded in the social mainstream. Even more striking, he said it was seen as proof of sophisticated Enlightenment thinking.
Wow. Okay, that's completely different from how we think of it now, Enlightenment thinking.
Right. Imagine that. Applying intellectual rigor, critical thinking, to what we now just label a conspiracy theory. For the Founding Fathers, people like that, scrutinizing potential plots by powerful people. That was just part of being a good, vigilant citizen. Now, Wood did suggest this changed, maybe around the turn of the 19th century. He implied Hofstadter's paranoid style might fit better later on as politics changed.
But even that shift is debated.
It is. Another historian, Jeffrey Cubitt, pushes back on that. He basically says that this recession, the supposed decline of mainstream conspiracy thinking that Wood suggested, well, Cubitt argues it shows very little signs of having happened during the 19th and early 20th centuries. His research suggests this kind of thinking stayed more integrated into society for longer than Hofstadter, or even Wood, maybe allowed for. It kind of throws a wrench into the idea that it suddenly became fringe at some specific point in history, suggests it's been more persistent.
So what's the big takeaway from all this historical digging? It really sounds like how we label something a conspiracy theory today.
Well, it wasn't always seen that way. It's not this fixed, unchanging category. It's something scholars are constantly reevaluating, which feels like a big shift from the common view. Precisely.
Yeah.
And that ties into a really crucial point.
Yeah.
The very concept of conspiracy theory as a describable social and psychological phenomenon has its own history. It's not this static label you can just slap on anything across time and culture. It's evolved. And how we interpret it now reflects our own time, our own ways of thinking, understanding that history is vital. Because how we label these things dramatically shapes how we understand why they exist, what they do, their impact. Calling something a conspiracy theory today carries this weight, right? This dismissal. That wasn't always the case.
Okay, so given that shifting history, it makes sense maybe why some academic fields were slow to jump in.
Yeah, perhaps not surprising. Disciplines like psychology, political science, they were initially quite slow to really investigate conspiracy theories seriously.
Hmm.
For a long time, I think across many fields, they were just seen as this fringe curiosity undeserving of serious discussion. You know, in political science in the 50s and 60s, the focus was really on measurable things, partisanship, ideology, voting patterns. Then later, this rational choice paradigm took hold, which basically assumes people act rationally to maximize their interests. And conspiracy theories, framed by Hofstadter as irrational and unscientific, just didn't fit that picture. They were like anomalies that got overlooked.
Until people realized they weren't just anomalies.
Exactly. Researchers started recognizing, hey, this isn't just a weird fringe thing. It's actually widespread and has potentially serious consequences for policy, for social trust, even for people's health. That realization kind of spurred a new wave of research. But even then, you see these fundamental differences in how different disciplines tackle it. Makes talking across fields pretty tricky.
Right, like that disciplinary divide you mentioned. Almost like they're looking at the same thing but asking totally different questions, using different tools.
That's a perfect way to put it. Take psychology versus, say, cultural studies. Their basic assumptions can be almost diametrically opposed. There's often little dialogue between the two, which is a real shame for getting a full picture. Psychologists, naturally, they want to find the universal predictors and drivers of conspiracy ideation beyond local difference. They're looking for the common cognitive wiring, the emotional triggers that make anyone, anywhere, susceptible. The universal blueprint, if you like.
Whereas cultural historians are more focused on the specific context.
Exactly. They're deeply rooted in specifics. They want to understand the ways that conspiracy theory has functioned in specific historical, political, and media environments. They argue the whole concept is historically contingent, culturally specific. It looks different. It means different things, depending on the time and place. So that creates this really interesting tension, right? What one field sees as a universal psychological mechanism, another sees as a product of particular social conditions. It's a key debate.
So how have academics tried to conceptualize it then? Beyond just defining it, what's the deeper meaning they're looking for?
Well, there are some fascinating takes. Scholars like Dean, for instance, looked at things like alien abduction theories, and they saw them not necessarily as literal accounts of aliens, but more as symptoms of a distrust in politicians and institutions, something deeply woven into American culture. Less about E.T., more about feeling powerless against hidden forces.
Okay, so a kind of societal anxiety manifesting.
Yeah, and Milley had a similar idea with his concept of agency panic. He saw conspiracy theories as expressing this deep worry about a loss of autonomy, challenges to our sense of identity in the modern world. He argued that as society gets more complex, more interconnected, people can feel like their ability to act freely, even to define themselves, is being chipped away by these huge impersonal systems. He even pointed out how the paranoid imagination you saw in Cold War texts, vast systems controlling people, actually shared assumptions with popular social theories of the time. It suggests the anxieties and conspiracy theories weren't always that far removed from mainstream intellectual worries. They were maybe a popular way of expressing deeper critiques of society.
And then there was Boltanski, the sociologist.
Right, Luke Boltanski. He did this really interesting study looking at detective fiction, actually, and he highlighted these potentially confounding similarities between what he called the hermeneutic of suspicion, which is basically the engine behind a lot of critical social theory, and the core assumption of conspiracy theories.
Hermeneutic of suspicion. Okay, break that down a bit.
It's that deeply skeptical way of looking at the world,
Yeah.
right? Always questioning, always assuming there's a hidden agenda, a deeper meaning under the surface. Standard practice in critical analysis. Boltanski's point was that this critical approach shares a fundamental operating assumption with conspiracy theory. the idea that nothing is as it seems.
Oh,
Yeah, it makes you pause. It suggests that a certain kind of critical thinking, the kind that's always digging for hidden power structures, can, in some ways, mirror the starting point of conspiratorial thinking, obviously with very different goals and methods, but that shared premise is interesting.
here's where it gets really interesting. So it sounds like we're not just talking about crazy stories sometimes. We might be talking about deeply ingrained ways of thinking, almost worldviews, that can actually run parallel to other kinds of critical thought. That's
Yeah,
unsettling, maybe.
it is a powerful connection. And just to hammer that home, Michael Butters even argued that American conspiracy theories for a long time generated official knowledge.
Official knowledge.
Yeah, that's a huge shift from Hofstadter's fringe idea. Butter suggests this only really changed in the 1960s, right around the time Hofstadter was writing, and the term conspiracy theory became widespread and, frankly, pathologized. So it implies this fascinating historical flip, where what was once maybe a valid, even official way of making sense of power later got dismissed as irrational. That historical context just completely reframes how we should think about it today.
Okay, so with that really nuanced historical and conceptual background, let's shift focus now to the individual level, the psychology. Why do people actually believe in these theories? It's clear they're a bigger part of our culture now, right? Fueled by, as one source put it, the unease of an anxious world, and of course, high-speed information exchange and social media. This environment just seems like fertile ground for these ideas to sprout and spread. They often tap right into our fears, our uncertainties, maybe even our desire for easy answers.
Definitely. The appeal is complex, multi-layered. It often plugs into some very basic human needs. First, they tend to offer simple explanations for complex problems. When the world feels chaotic, confusing, a straightforward story, even if it's elaborate, can feel really comforting. It brings a sense of order.
Right, makes things feel less random.
Exactly. Second, they can validate pre-existing beliefs or biases. If you already distrust the government or feel like an outsider, a theory that confirms that feeling, that explains why you feel marginalized. It's naturally going to resonate.
Yeah, fits your worldview.
And third, maybe the most powerful thing, they can give you a sense of control in times of chaos or confusion. When everything feels out of your hands, believing you understand the hidden plot, the secret forces, it can actually give you back a feeling of agency, like you're in the know, you see what's really going on.
And this is where our own minds can kind of trip us up with cognitive biases.
Absolutely. Conspiracy theories really thrive on cognitive biases. These are basically those mental shortcuts our brains use all the time to make sense of the world quickly. Usually helpful, but they can definitely lead us down the wrong path sometimes. Let's look at a couple of key ones that really fuel conspiracy beliefs. First up is proportionality bias. This is the tendency to believe that significant events must have substantial causes. It's just hard for us to accept that monumental occurrences could result from simple, mundane causes. Our brains kind of want the cause to match the scale of the effect.
So, like, a huge event needs a huge explanation.
Precisely. A classic example, and one that still echoes today, is the assassination of JFK back in 1963. For so many people, it's just incredibly difficult to wrap their heads around the idea that such a massive, nation-shaking event killing the president could be the work of one lone, seemingly insignificant guy like Lee Harvey Oswald.
This scale just feels wrong.
Exactly. The sheer magnitude of Kennedy's death seems to demand a bigger cause. So people are drawn to theories involving the CIA, the mafia, maybe LBJ. These provide those grand, intricate plots that fit the event's magnitude. They satisfy that proportionality bias, even if the evidence is really thin compared to the official findings.
Okay, that makes sense. What's another big one?
Confirmation bias. This one is incredibly powerful, maybe one of the most pervasive biases we have. It's our tendency to seek out and focus on information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs while ignoring or dismissing contradicting evidence. Once someone starts down the path of believing a conspiracy theory, confirmation bias kicks in hard. They become really good at spotting anything that seems to support their view and just brushing off anything that challenges it. It's like putting on filter glasses.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure, the moon landing hoax theory is a perfect case study in confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Despite overwhelming evidence, we have moon rocks, thousands of independent checks from other countries tracking the missions, astronaut testimonies, believers insist it was all faked by NASA.
Right, staged in a studio somewhere.
Exactly. They largely ignore all that overwhelming evidence. Instead, they zoom in on tiny perceived anomalies in photos or videos. Things like the fluttering flag, which they say implies wind, impossible in a vacuum, or odd shadows. These anomalies, which usually have simple explanations based on physics or the tech of the time, become their proof. Meanwhile, all the counter-evidence is just dismissed as part of the cover-up. It's a completely self-sealing logic loop.
Wow. Okay, so cognitive biases are huge. What about social factors? Does who we hang out with, who we trust, play a role?
Oh, absolutely critical. Social influences are huge. Conspiracy theories really flourish in environments where there's high mistrust in authorities. When people don't trust the government or the media or scientists, they're naturally going to be more open to alternative explanations, right? Especially ones that paint those institutions as corrupt or deceptive. These theories offer alternative explanations that align more with an individual's worldview, particularly if you already feel marginalized or suspicious of mainstream narratives. Finding a community that shares that skepticism, that offers a coherent story, even if it's a conspiracy, can be incredibly validating for people who feel alienated. That sense of belonging is powerful.
And you mentioned something about emotional maturity. Is there a link there too?
Yeah, interestingly, there is research suggesting a link. One study found a negative correlation between emotional intelligence and belief in conspiracy theories.
Negative correlation. So higher emotional intelligence means less belief.
That's right. Basically, individuals with higher emotional intelligence, which is a big part of emotional maturity, that ability to understand and manage your own emotions and recognize them in others, they seem less likely to believe these theories.
Why is that? What's the connection?
The thinking is that people with higher emotional intelligence are generally better at handling ambiguity and uncertainty. They can tolerate not knowing everything, they can accept that complex issues don't always have simple answers, and they can manage the discomfort that comes with that ambiguity. This makes the simplistic black-and-white explanations offered by many conspiracy theories less appealing. They don't feel that same urgent psychological need for a neat, tidy answer that blames some hidden force. Their resilience makes them less susceptible.
That's really interesting. So for you listening, if you find yourself, or maybe someone you care about, getting drawn into these kinds of theories, feeling that pull, what can you actually do? Our sources suggest a few practical things focused on empowerment. First, it's about working on those critical thinking skills, learning how to evaluate information, how to differentiate between reliable and unreliable sources. That's just fundamental today, with so much stuff flying around online.
Absolutely crucial.
Second, and maybe just as important, is trying to engage in open and empathetic dialogue. The key word there is empathetic, non-judgmental. It's about trying to understand why the theory appeals to someone, what need it might be filling for them, instead of just shutting them down or shaming them. Sometimes approaching it with genuine curiosity can open doors that judgment slams shut.
That's a really important point. Dismissal often backfires.
And finally, sometimes if these beliefs are causing real distress or leading to harmful actions, considering professional help might be the way to go. Talking to a therapist could provide a safe space to explore the roots of these beliefs, maybe uncover underlying fears or anxieties that are driving it. It's a process, right? Every step towards questioning, towards learning more about the world and ourselves is positive. Okay, let's take all of that, the history, the psychology, the social factors, and look at a really powerful recent example, QAnon. This movement became infamous partly because of its role in the January 6th Capitol riot, and it really shows how these theories spread today, often through really surprising routes. QAnon's generally described as a far-right extremist big tent conspiracy theory. Big tent meaning it pulls in a whole lot of different, sometimes even conflicting beliefs under one banner. The core story revolves around this idea of a secret ongoing war being waged by a supposed high-level government insider called Q against a cabal of pedophilic ruling elites.
Right, this hidden battle narrative.
And adherents believe that prominent figures, politicians, celebrities, wealthy liberals, often including Jewish figures, are involved in this horrifying stuff, like harvesting adrenochrome from children in satanic rituals to gain power or stay young. They also often believe that Donald Trump was somehow ordained by God to liberate the world from this cabal, like a divine figure in this cosmic battle.
And it's so important to understand where those specific ideas, the pedophile cabal, the blood rituals, actually come from. Researchers trace them straight back to one of the most notorious pieces of anti-Semitic propaganda ever, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
The Russian forgery from the early 1900s.
Exactly. Published around 1903, falsely claiming to reveal a Jewish plot for world domination, often involving secret groups and harming children. It's the same vile stuff the Nazis used extensively to justify their persecution. So QAnon, while seeming new, is really just recycling these incredibly dangerous old prejudices. It's repackaged anti-Semitism and blood libel for the internet age. That historical context is chilling and vital.
Absolutely vital. Now, what's really striking about QAnon is who believes it and how it's spread. It kind of defies easy stereotypes, doesn't it?
It really does. While it's often linked strongly to Republicans, and it certainly has a base there, the data shows a surprising spread. Our sources point out that a sizable number of those who identify as Democrats, around 8%, and independents, about 14%, also reported believing the core QAnon claim about this Satan-worshipping pedophile group controlling the U.S.
Wait, 8% of Democrats and 14% of independents? That's significant.
It is. When you add them up, it almost matches the percentage of Republicans who believed it, which was around 23%. It just underscores that this isn't confined to one political box. It found believers across a wider spectrum than many might assume.
And how did it manage that? How did it reach people who wouldn't normally be associated with far-right extremism?
That's the key finding. QAnon brilliantly, or perhaps insidiously, managed to infiltrate 3 separate cultural entry points not typically associated with the movement.
Yeah.
These were identified as yoga and wellness groups, neo-shamanistic circles, and psychics. By slipping into these spaces often focused on self-help, spirituality, alternative health. QAnon could embed itself, kind of disguise its abrasive features, and fly under the radar of the general public. It was often a soft entry point, drawing people in gradually, sometimes through trusted influencers within those communities.
That's incredibly clever and deeply concerning. It really highlights how the internet allows movements, even extreme ones like white power groups, to rebrand themselves, right? Make themselves look aesthetically pleasing, maybe even sophisticated or spiritually enlightened.
Absolutely. And think about how online platforms themselves can contribute. Social media algorithms, for instance, are often designed in ways that inadvertently incentivize content creators to produce media that is increasingly more extreme.
Because extreme stuff gets more clicks, more engagement.
Often, yes. Sensational, emotionally charged content tends to keep people scrolling, sharing, commenting. That engagement drives the platform's revenue, and it's not always accidental. We've seen evidence of alt-right groups deliberately targeting online gaming communities, embedding Nazi symbols or white supremacist codes into seemingly harmless games or forums. Places like 4chan have become notorious for hijacking existing culture, taking memes, symbols, narratives, and twisting them for extremist purposes, making hateful ideas seem edgy or cool, especially to younger audiences seeking community or rebellion.
This whole idea of manipulating culture for ideological and maybe commercial purposes, it really sounds like that Frankfurt School concept you mentioned earlier, Horkheimer and Adorno's culture industry.
It's an incredibly relevant lens, yes. The term culture industry was their direct critique of popular culture. They argued popular was misleading because it implied culture bubbles up organically from the people. Instead, they saw it as something imposed from the top down or administered. A highly organized system for mass-producing cultural goods, just like any other industry.
And what were their main concerns about that?
2 big things. First, standardization. Mass communication tech radio, film back then, allowed for quick, cheap, and profitable reproduction. Culture became driven by profit, not necessarily artistic merit or critical thought. Their fear was this would create a cultural sphere devoid of critical thought, just pumping out predictable entertainment that would dull the intellectual capacity of consumers, make them passive.
And therefore more easily manipulated, susceptible to authoritarianism.
Exactly. That was their deep worry, that a population pacified by standardized culture would be less able to resist oppressive forces, opening the door to authoritarianism and to fascism. The second feature they identified was pseudo-individualization. This is the idea that while products are marketed as unique, tailored to you, they're actually derived from a common formula. They tap into collective feelings to create a sense of personal connection, but it's formulaic. Different genres for different markets, but the underlying structure is often the same. Now, Horkheimer and Adorno worried about radio's one-way power, but think about modern live streaming, interactive internet content. It uses similar social psychological techniques to manipulate consumers, but it's potentially even more powerful because it feels interactive, personal. QAnon creators use this brilliantly, building this intense sense of connection, of shared secret knowledge with their followers. It leverages those culture industry dynamics on steroids.
So bringing this back to QAnon, how did this play out specifically in those alternative spaces, the yoga groups, the neo-shamans? Can you give us some concrete examples of this infiltration?
Yes, let's look at how it worked on the ground. First, within neo-shamanism, the most visible example is probably Jacob Chansley, the QAnon shaman. His writings and statements show this really complex mix. He talks about high vibratory fields, manipulating frequencies with the mind. He saw his actions at the Capitol, yelling in the Senate, as a form of shamanic cleansing.
Cleansing it from evil, raising the vibration.
That was his frame, yes. And what's fascinating is how he blends that with other views. He has these partially progressive views about Monsanto's ecological footprint, calls them an evil corporation, recognizes his own power as a consumer. But then right alongside that, he believes daily prayer can clean up Fukushima, and he fully buys into the QAnon idea of underground tunnels for child trafficking. It's that rigid good versus evil structure, avoiding complexity, seeking one big malevolent enemy.
Okay, so a blend of seemingly disparate ideas under one umbrella. What about the starseeds?
All right, this is another fascinating niche. Think UFOs meets New Age spirituality meets conspiracy. A figure called Akashic Daddy is one example. He openly talks about living in a full-on global MK Ultra situation, believing Hollywood, the media, music, it's all brainwashing us. And he explicitly connects this to the Q map, that sprawling diagram linking various conspiracies, all leading to the Great Awakening, the moment everyone supposedly wakes up to the QAnon truth. It gives adherents a mission to wake others up.
And the wellness and yoga instructors, that seems like the most surprising entry point for many people.
It does, because it feels so far removed. But this soft version of QAnon was very effective there. It drew in unsuspecting people looking for health, community, spirituality. The messaging was often subtle, mixed in with genuine health advice. Take Troy Casey, the certified health nut. He combines real bodybuilding information and other wellness techniques with a constant stream of misinformation and political ideology. He often pushes essentialist ideas about race, gender, sexuality, very rigid traditional roles.
Can you give an example of how that blend works?
Yeah, there's this podcast clip with Casey and another influencer, Har Hari, the Sikh Kundalini yoga guy.
Yeah.
They start off talking about prejudice against Sikhs after 9/11, which sounds progressive, but then it pivots wildly. Har Hari claims hair is an antenna for cosmic energy, and men's beards insulate you from the moon, because the moon has feminine energy men shouldn't be influenced by.
Seriously, insulates you from the moon.
Yep. And Casey jumps right in, adding, I heard that the beard protects you against the feminine charms. It's a stark example of how they reinforce toxic masculinity, associating femininity with weakness, something to be shielded from, while linking traditional male appearance to cosmic power and hidden knowledge.
Wow.
Casey then connects his beard to getting more respect, being seen as an elder, again reinforcing this rigid masculinity, seeking status through hidden knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And then, bam, it pivots straight to QAnon. Casey brings up Trump's famous cafe tweet.
Oh yeah, cafe. What was his take?
He interprets it as code for an antidote for 5G ionization, CO for cobalt, Fe for iron, suggesting it protects against 5G's supposed harm. It sounds bizarre, but it shows perfectly how anything can be twisted to fit the narrative, and how these wellness spaces become gateways, pulling people towards the manosphere, those online groups blaming feminism for society's ills.
Okay, and the last group, numerologists and psychics. How did QAnon fit in there?
It's paradoxical, right? Because QAnon often frames magic as a tool of the deep state, something dark. Yet within the movement, particularly forms of numerology, are widely used to find divine messages, or as a cryptographic tool to decode Q's cryptic online posts. Brian Protzman, or Negative 48, is a key example. He's the one who famously told followers to go to Dallas to await JFK's resurrection.
Right, I remember that. It didn't happen, obviously.
No. And tragically, many followers who'd traveled, spent their savings, reportedly ended up funding the group and even drinking of bleach as part of some purification ritual. Protzman uses gematria, assigning numbers to words to find cosmically aligned connections, like linking Trump and JFK numerically. He often just presents the numbers, letting the audience make the leap, creating that sense of shared secret insight. This branch believes JFK is alive and will return.
And Tom numbers. Similar idea.
Similar technique, assigning values to letters, finding numerical matches between things like Friday the 13th and King or Alien, suggesting cosmic links without really explaining how, leaving it open to interpretation. It just shows the sheer variety of pathways QAnon exploited, tapping into existing beliefs, spiritual practices, wellness trends to embed its ideology.
It seems like underneath some of this, there might be certain psychological tendencies at play. You mentioned the authoritarian personality earlier. How does that fit in?
Yeah, it's a concept that helps make sense of some of these surprising connections. Adorno, from the Frankfurt School, noted that even self-identified leftists can become oriented toward authoritarianism. It's not always about strict political labels. It can be a gradual shift driven by exposure to certain ideas and, fundamentally, a wish for order and stability. Later researchers like Altmaier simplified it, suggesting this core desire for order and control is the key predictor.
So it's less about left-right politics and more about a personality type.
In this context, yes. It helps explain why some youth subcultures, which often define themselves against the mainstream, can ironically become susceptible. Alt-right groups are skilled at tapping into that countercultural tendency, that feeling of resentment among people who think institutions don't represent them anymore, that the world's chaotic. That's potentially why someone who might have identified as a hippie in another era, questioning authority, seeking alternatives, could find someone like Trump appealing. They see him as disrupting a corrupt order, promising to restore stability, even if it's an authoritarian kind of stability.
What are the key traits of this authoritarian personality that showed up in these QAnon-linked spaces?
Well, Adorno and others identify several, but three really stand out in the examples we've discussed. First, conventionalism. That's a rigid adherence to traditional values, often middle-class ones. You see that in the talk about strict gender roles, traditional masculinity we heard from Casey and Harhari. Anything different is suspect.
Okay, conventionalism.
What else? Second, superstition and stereotyping. This involves believing in mystical forces determining fate and thinking in very rigid black and white categories. Think about the numerology, finding hidden codes, cosmic alignments, and also the QAnon shaman's absolute good versus evil worldview. No room for nuance, just a clear enemy.
Got it. And the third?
Power and toughness. This is a preoccupation with dominance and submission, identifying strongly with powerful figures, asserting strength. It fits perfectly with the QAnon narrative of Trump as this ordained liberator, this strongman fighting the evil cabal. It speaks to a deep desire for a powerful leader to fix things, vanquish enemies. These aren't just abstract concepts. They're like the psychological glue holding these seemingly disparate QAnon beliefs together into a coherent, if flawed, worldview.
So what are the bigger implications of QAnon spreading through these spiritual and wellness communities, this conspirituality idea?
Well, one key observation is that stigmatized knowledge tends to occupy the same spot. Ideas already outside the mainstream alternative healing, certain spiritual beliefs can kind of cluster together and feed off other forms of stigmatized knowledge, like conspiracy theories. And this specific blend, conspirituality, often seems deeply rooted in individualism. It reflects that hyper-individualism you see online, where people curate their own belief systems from bits and pieces, often lacking community in a traditional supportive sense. It's kind of DIY spirituality that can leave people vulnerable.
Vulnerable how?
From a sociological viewpoint, it acts like a Trojan horse. Far-right groups can strategically use these seemingly benign, if not liberal, cultural phenomenon to hide their embedded far-right messaging. They leverage the openness, the search for meaning in these spaces, to slip in extremist ideas. And it's not just ideology, it's often tied to funding. More followers means more donations, turning belief into a business model.
So it comes back to the commodification of culture.
Exactly. When cultural practices get co-opted primarily for profit or political gain, they lose their emancipatory potential. Instead of fostering critical thought or genuine connection, they become pipelines for profit and, dangerously, for extremist ideologies and harmful misinformation. It's a stark warning about how tech geared towards engagement and profit without enough checks can really warp public discourse, fragment communities, and even nurture authoritarian thinking by exploiting our very real human desires for well-being and belonging.
This leads us right into a huge challenge for us as individuals and for technology. How do you tell the difference between genuine critical thinking and a conspiratorial narrative? It's not always obvious, is it? And getting it wrong has real consequences.
It's absolutely crucial. Our sources define conspiracy theories specifically as attempts to explain the ultimate causes of significant events as cover plots orchestrated by secret, powerful, and malicious groups. The key words there are secret plots and malicious groups.
Okay, so there's an assumption of bad intent and hidden orchestration. How does that differ from critical thinking?
Critical thinking, simply put, is the process of objectively analyzing and evaluating information to form a reasoned judgment and putting them forth for the public view. It's about asking hard questions, demanding evidence, being open about your sources and methods, but without automatically jumping to the conclusion that there's a hidden evil plot behind everything. It's skeptical inquiry, not predetermined accusation.
And why is getting that distinction right so important?
Because mislabeling genuinely critical messages as conspiratorial can push curious individuals towards conspiracy communities. Think about it. If someone raises legitimate questions about, say, a public health policy, and they're immediately shut down as a conspiracy theorist, they might feel alienated, unheard.
And then they might go looking for answers elsewhere.
Exactly. They might find communities that welcome their questions, even if those communities are built around actual conspiracy theories. So being accurate in how we label things is highly important, not just for platforms trying to moderate content, but for the health of public debate overall. We need to allow space for real questions.
And this is where the technology comes in, trying to automate this distinction, using things like natural language processing, NLP.
That's the cutting edge, yes. Teaching machines to understand the incredibly subtle differences in human language. A big effort here is the Oppositional Thinking Analysis task, presented at a major evaluation forum called PAN at CLEF 2024. It's specifically designed to help AI differentiate these nuances. It has two main parts.
Okay, what's the first part?
Subtask 1 is binary classification, basically teaching the AI to read a piece of text and decide, is this conspiracy or is this critical? Think about public health messages again. Can the AI tell the difference between someone asking for more data on vaccine side effects, critical, versus someone claiming vaccines are a secret plot by Bill Gates to implant microchips? Conspiracy. They used a data set with more critical messages than conspiracy ones, about 2,600 critical to 1,400 conspiracy. And they used a powerful AI model called a pre-trained BERT classifier with a sigmoid activation function to make that binary choice.
BERT, that's one of those big language models, right? How well did it do?
Well, it did okay at identifying the critical texts. It got an F1 critical score of about 0.8255. F1 score measures accuracy, balancing precision, and recall. So around 82% accuracy on critical text is pretty decent, but it struggled much more with identifying the conspiracy text. The F1 conspiracy score dropped way down to 0.4224.
Wow, less than half as accurate. Why the big difference?
It really highlights how tricky it is, even for sophisticated AI, to definitively pin down the specific features of conspiratorial language versus just general skepticism or criticism.
Yeah.
The overall average score, F1 macro, was only 0.624. It shows the challenge isn't just detecting disagreement, it's detecting the type of disagreement.
Okay, so classifying whole text is hard. What was the second subtask?
Subtask 2 went even more granular. It's called token-level classification. Here, the goal is to identify specific elements within the text. Things like the agent, who's supposedly doing the conspiring, the facilitator, who's helping, the victim, the campaigner, who's fighting it, the objective, what's the goal, the negative effect. This requires span-level classification. The AI has to pinpoint the exact words or voices, like identifying the global elite as the agent.
That sounds incredibly complex. How did it do there?
Not well, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The results were quite low, a span F1 score of just 0.0150 and a microspan F1 of 0.0600. It suggests that while AI can get a general sense of a text classification sometimes, teaching it to understand the precise roles and relationships within the narrative is still a massive challenge. Nuanced semantic understanding is hard for machines.
What kinds of techniques are they using to try and improve this?
A whole range of NLP approaches. There's feature-based classification, using older methods like SVMs, looking at word frequencies, syntax patterns. Graph-based methods try to map out how ideas connect structurally. Sentiment analysis looks for emotional cues, distrust, fear versus skepticism. Topic modeling techniques like LDA try to find hidden themes in large amounts of text, but the real advances are coming from contextual embeddings, especially models like BERT and GPT. Because they're trained on so much text, they're better at capturing nuanced contextual information and subtle linguistic cues, sarcasm, implication, the difference between worry and accusation. That's crucial here.
And those deep learning models are performing better overall.
Yes. The research shows models like especially BERT consistently outperform the older methods on these tasks. It definitely shows promise for more automated detection and analysis. That could really help with effective content moderation, managing the fire hose of online information, creating safer spaces for discussion about public health and other complex topics. But as those low scores on the second task show, it's far from perfect. There's a real risk of misclassification, so ongoing refinement and human oversight are absolutely essential.
It's a critical, practical challenge, but it also pushes us into some deeper philosophical territory, doesn't it? Beyond just true-false or what AI can detect, it makes you ask, are conspiracy theories automatically suspect? Is it ever reasonable to actually be a conspiracy theorist? It touches on that really tricky line distinguishing warranted conspiracy theories, ones with good evidence, even if not fully proven yet, from unwarranted ones that are just baseless speculation.
Exactly. And this philosophical discussion isn't about defending the mad, bad, or dangerous conspiracy theories like QAnon or Flat Earth. Nobody sensible is defending those. It's more about defending the act of conspiracy theorizing itself, in certain contexts, as potentially a valid, even necessary form of critical inquiry. It raises an important question about healthy skepticism. There's a big difference between naively dismissing all claims of conspiracy, which is dangerous, because powerful groups do sometimes conspire in secret, and engaging in a careful, evidence-based process of scrutinizing power, questioning official stories, demanding transparency.
Can you give an example to make that distinction clearer? Warranted versus unwarranted?
Sure, a classic warranted conspiracy theory would be Watergate. Initially, the idea that Nixon's top aides, maybe even the president himself, were involved in the break-in and a cover-up, that was a conspiracy theory. But through solid investigative journalism, whistleblowers, legal processes, overwhelming evidence emerged, proving a real criminal conspiracy had occurred. The theory became warranted by facts.
Okay, so evidence turned the theory into fact. What's an unwarranted one?
An unwarranted one would be something like the Flat Earth theory, or the belief that 9/11 was an inside job by the U.S. government. Despite mountains of scientific evidence, engineering analysis, eyewitness accounts proving otherwise, these theories persist. Believers typically dismiss all contradictory evidence as part of the elaborate cover-up. They demand impossible proof for the official account while accepting incredibly flimsy evidence for their own. The key is the lack of verifiable, independent proof, and often the theory is unfalsifiable. Any evidence against it just becomes part of the conspiracy.
That makes sense. So some philosophers are trying to find a way to study these things without just lumping them all together.
Yes, some are proposing frameworks like particularism. The idea is to understand each theory on its own terms, in its specific context, rather than trying to apply one universal psychological or historical label. It argues against broad generalizations. It stresses understanding not just what people believe, but why it matters to them, in their specific situation, social, political, personal, and what the wider effects are. It suggests that really diving deep into the specifics of each case gives a much richer, more accurate picture than trying to find one single theory of conspiracy thinking that explains everything.
This has been an absolutely packed deep dive. We've covered so much ground. We've seen conspiracy theories aren't simple. They've evolved, weren't always fringe, sometimes even mirrored critical thought. We looked at the psychology, how they tap into deep needs, biases, offer comfort or control. We saw how the digital age changed everything, letting them spread into unexpected places like wellness communities, sometimes leveraging authoritarian traits. And finally, that crucial challenge, telling them apart from critical thinking, which is vital for society and a huge task for technology. So after exploring all of that, what does this all mean for you listening right now?
I think this deep dive really drives home that knowledge is most valuable when understood and applied, especially now with this constant information overload where stories can be spun and spread so fast. It's really an encouragement for you to keep practicing critical thinking, keep questioning assumptions, whether they come from the mainstream or from the fringes. And it highlights this urgent need for productive dialogue among individuals with competing narratives about reality. We can't just rely on tech to sort this out for us. Tech can help identify patterns, sure, but the fundamental human stuff, understanding, empathy, talking openly, listening, that's still paramount for navigating these really complex, often divisive issues.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to chew on, something that really struck me from our discussion about those unexpected pathways. If, as our sources suggest, the simple practice of going to a yoga class or a wellness coach may provide tangible health benefits, but may also promote pseudoscientific, dangerous medical misinformation or justify existing xenophobic ideas, then how do you responsibly navigate that search for knowledge, for health, for well-being in a world where seemingly harmless paths, genuine quests for connection, can sometimes lead us down these really surprising, really challenging rabbit holes? It's a question that I think demands real care, constant awareness, and genuine curiosity. Keep diving deep and keep questioning.